It was Judge Doom. He framed Roger Rabbit for murder as part of a scheme to replace public transportation in Los Angeles with a freeway that would allow him to earn a fortune from his personal real estate holdings that bordered the road. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. The gang accompany a world-famous oceanographer during a salvage operation. Unfortunately, the mission is put in danger when a ghost pirate and his monster crew attempt to frighten them away. Mr. Carp, the first mate of the research vessel Sea Prowler, along with 2 other crewmen, secretly mutinied against their captain and leader of the salvage operation, Professor Poisson. They staged their own disappearances to secretly steal the object of the mission, valuable golden relics and treasure from the Diablo d'Oro, a sunken Spanish galleon.
This will make a terrific science report for school, Professor Poisson.
A salvage mission with the world's greatest oceanographer. Wow!
Yeah, thanks for inviting us, Professor.
When I was in high school, a science report meant going to the library and reading a couple of books. The more elaborate ones sometimes required performing an experiment or 2 in the school lab. Whereas the Scooby Gang were able to wrangle a sea voyage with a legendary oceanographer. I think it's safe to say they come from very wealthy families. As it was Poisson who invited them, he may have been trying to secure funds for his operation and knew that taking a group of rich kids along with him could be a great way to make their parents open their wallets. Not to mention finagling some free labor.
And since you are all experienced scuba divers, you may thank me by assisting in the salvage.
All right, Shaggy, now what was it you just remembered?
That I can't swim!
The Maritime Museum has asked me to recover ancient golden relics from the wreck of the ill-fated Diablo d'Oro.
When asking Google Translate for the meaning of Diablo d'Oro from Spanish to English, it says Golden Devil. However, when asking Google Translate for the meaning of Golden Devil from English to Spanish, it says Diablo Dorado. Considering the sunken vessel was filled with gold, it's safe to assume the writers meant for the ship to have been named Golden Devil in Spanish. I took French and not Spanish in school, so I have no idea what's going on here.
We researched what little is known about the wreck, Professor.
Right. The Diablo d'Oro was skippered by one Captain Francisco Pescado.
There be rumors that after 3 centuries, the ghost of Captain Pescado still walks the slimy decks of the Diablo d'Oro and guards her against all intruders.
The shipwreck had been captained by Francisco Pescado, and according to legend, his ghost haunted the remains of his ship, aided by sea monsters. While Pescado had been a real pirate in the Scooby-Doo-universe according to Velma's research, the idea that the sunken vessel is haunted by his ghost is accounted by Carp, and as he's the villain, it's possible he made up the legend. Incidentally, every character's name in this episode is a fish pun. The main villain is named Carp, and we learn later his henchmen are called McFinn and McGill, all of which are obvious, whereas Pescado and Poisson both mean fish in Spanish and French respectively. Speaking of Captain Poisson, he is a clear homage to Jacques Cousteau, a famous French oceanographer who, among other projects, had a series of popular television documentaries in the 1960s and 1970s. I wonder if he knew how to perform exorcisms. Carp and his cohorts dressed up as Pescado and his monster crew to try and scare away Poisson and the gang, leaving them alone to steal all the gold from the Diablo d'Oro themselves. This should have been a relatively low-risk operation for the villains, provided they could get rid of everyone else. The crime took place in international waters, far from help, so Poisson and the gang should not have been of any concern for the mutineers.
Creepers! The door's locked!
Never mind. We can get out the port side.
Come on, Daphne.
Locked in a tin can!
Unfortunately for Carp and his men, their scheme relied on kidnapping and confining their victims rather than taking more permanent steps to get them out of the way. This showed a baffling lack of commitment, considering just how valuable their plot was. Seriously. Look at how much gold we're talking about. Between what the gang saw in the remains of the Diablo d'Oro and how much the villains had managed to bring to the surface, this was a ridiculous amount of gold. Even setting aside the historical value of any artifacts, just the raw value of the precious metal itself is immense. Almost a decade after this episode aired, a comparable Spanish treasure ship was recovered and at the time was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. That recovery also resulted in a lengthy court battle as the wreck was found off the coast of a particular state that subsequently tried to claim possession of the entire fortune. This highlights one of the trickier aspects of maritime recovery. Who owns the wreck? It's often the case that whenever one is found that contains any treasure, a legal firestorm begins between the original owners of the ship, if applicable, the country where the ship originated, the country where the wreck was found, the people who found it, the people who invested in the company that found it, etc. The fact that Poisson was specifically and openly hired by a maritime museum to recover the gold would imply that at least in this case, ownership of the wreck was clearly established. However, this doesn't solve the issue that Carp and his two henchmen would have to overcome. How would they dispose of the gold, assuming they were able to steal it? Wait a minute. A trio of bad guys dress up as aquatic monsters in order to scare people away from a sunken Spanish galleon so they could secretly steal the gold treasure from the wreck. Why does that sound familiar? This is yet another recycled plot from an earlier Scooby-Doo episode. Though in the earlier one, the villains had thought far enough ahead to prepare a smelting operation to melt down the gold for transport. Here, Carp and the rest still had a large hurdle to overcome if they wanted to convert their stolen treasure into cash. This is not an insignificant problem for the bad guys. Just ask Tommy Thompson. It is possible Carp already had an outside buyer set up to handle the gold and relics. And if that was the case, going by the usual 20% estimation for fenced goods, even if the treasure's total value was $100 million, that'd still be $20 million for the three men. In today's money, that would be well over $100 million when accounting for inflation. With that much money on the line, the oceanographer and the gang are lucky to be alive. I'm giving Carp and his crew a design score of 4 out of 5. It was extremely valuable and well worth the risk, just not very original, and a bit short-sighted to not have a more permanent way of dealing with witnesses. Carp dressed up as a pirate ghost and his two henchmen dressed as sea monsters, with one being based on an octopus and the other essentially a walking pile of kelp. This is not the first time we've seen ghost pirates and sea monsters in the Scooby-Doo universe, but at least this time around, all the costume designs themselves were original. Well, mostly. I could see if someone wanted to argue that the kelp monster looked a lot like the green globs from the Mama Cass episode. Though personally, I think it looked more like Man-Thing from Marvel Comics. Captain Pescado's design is disturbing, and I think the octopus monster is scary enough to frighten most people if they were to run into it on a deserted ship in the eerie, foggy sea. I am not convinced the kelp monster was an effective disguise, however. Though not as popular in most Western countries, kelp is a staple food item in areas like Japan. The gang may as well have been chased by a giant cabbage. Which apparently they were in one of the Scooby-Doo comics. A scheme involving spending time underwater means that in addition to looking like a pirate ghost and sea creatures, the costumes also had to allow the wearer to survive the ocean depths. This wasn't as important with the demon shark in my last video, as it only appeared underwater briefly in a single scene, and Wells could have simply been holding his breath while trying to scare Shaggy and Scooby.
Hey, look! There's a clue!
Clue? They look like air tanks to me.
They are. But why would a ghost and sea monsters need air tanks? Also, we knew we were dealing with mortals when we swam down to the wreck and saw all those extra air tanks.
In this episode, however, the three villains needed to be able to stay underwater for long periods of time, and indeed the gang finds scuba tanks which, much like in the case of Captain Cutler, clued them in that the supernatural entities chasing them may not have been authentic. I do question how exactly Carp was able to use his Scooby gear, as his mask didn't seem to allow for a breathing regulator in his mouth. At least with the octopus and kelp monsters, an argument could be made that their headgear had enough room to hold their equipment. Additionally, despite Velma not noticing as she didn't bring it up during the unmasking, bubbles clearly surrounded the ghost and the sea monsters when they were underwater, making it obvious they were using breathing equipment, something no ghost or sea monster should have required. Speaking of scuba suits, for those who weren't aware, the inspiration for Professor Poisson, Jacques Cousteau, was one of their inventors. That is an incredibly articulated rubber suit, being able to lock a door with its tentacle like that.
Oh, it seems like every door on this ship is locked.
At least this one wasn't locked while we were inside.
Is this another panty shot in the early Scooby-Doo universe? It's lucky Velma discovered modesty later on.
SOS! SOS! Our position is...
SOS in Morse code would be ... Whatever Velma transmitted was not SOS. The disguises also seemed to glow occasionally, but this was inconsistent throughout the episode, and as the monster footprints were only ever shown to be wet and not radiant, nor was there any mention of phosphorus paint, I don't feel comfortable crediting the costumes with such effects. The octopus and kelp creatures were monsters, so they can be excused. However, Pescado was allegedly a ghost, but didn't feature any traditional ghost effects like glowing, flight, or transparency. The costumes may not have featured special effects, but they were mostly original and were suitable and practical for the location. In addition, 2 out of the 3 were reasonably frightening. 3.5 out of 5 for their outfit score. A significant portion of the episode, and one of the key points of Carp's scheme, was the kidnapping of Professor Poisson. And you should all know by now how I feel about kidnapping. It is one of the worst things a Scooby villain can do because it almost always just encourages the gang to stick around looking for the missing victim. This time was no exception.
Professor Poisson?
Zoinks!
Creepers!
There's been a struggle in here.
And the professor lost! He's gone!
I can understand why there'd be tipped over furniture and papers on the floor during a struggle between Poisson and the monsters, but why would the drawers be open like that? This looks more like someone was ransacking a room looking for something rather than a kidnapping.
First, we're gonna look for clues.
Then we'll try to find the professor. He must be aboard somewhere.
That's a big assumption, Fred. You guys are operating under the belief that the sea monsters took the professor. If that's the case, why would he still be on board the ship? Wouldn't it make more sense to assume his body is tucked somewhere inside a reef at the bottom of the ocean by now?
A broken pencil and a notepad.
Maybe the professor left a message.
The top page has been ripped off.
Why didn't Carp and his henchmen just take the whole notepad? It was small enough and not likely to be missed by anyone investigating the ransacked room, so its absence wouldn't have been considered suspicious.
But it left an impression on the next page. IMCMMSC.
Close.
That I is a 1.
Right.
Then again, the whole notepad plot point was pointless because it never came into play in the episode. It didn't help capture the villains, and it almost seems as though Velma didn't understand what the clue meant until the bad guys were already tied up.
Shaggy, you and Scooby start searching below.
We'll begin in the wheelhouse and work down to meet you.
We'll go over this ship with a fine-tooth comb.
No sign of the professor in here.
Right. Let's help Shag and Scooby search below decks.
Fred and the girls were in the wheelhouse for less than a minute. What was the point of splitting up when just a quick glance inside the room would have been enough to ascertain it was empty? Fred really does seem to have a neurological condition that demands he make them split up for searches, even when unnecessary. I suppose the rest of the gang are just humoring him to be nice.
Boy, this one's locked too. We're trapped in the wheelhouse.
I hope he's small enough to get through the ventilating funnel.
I made it, Velma. I'll climb down and open a door for you.
Why would the two girls be the ones to lift the heavy boy above themselves? Wouldn't it have made more sense to lift Velma, the smallest person in the room, especially if they were worried about getting stuck in the venting pipe? Or was this Velma's idea to get a little alone time with Daphne?
It's locked! And there's no other way out!
What are you doing in the smokestack?
Somebody locked me in the engine room and this was the only way out!
Later we see Velma do exactly that, crawling through a smokestack to escape the engine room where the villains had tried trapping her. Wait a minute. Velma just crawled through a smokestack. Shouldn't she look like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins?
You and Daphne had better hide. Captain Pescado and his sea monsters are headed for the ship.
We see them!
And they see us. This way, Daphne!
How in the hell did Pescado get in front of them like that? He and the other two were just chasing Fred and Daphne from behind.
What do we do now?
Let's try to... That's no ghost. That's Morse code. SOS!
I'm not into ham radio. I've had sex. But from what I can tell, it sounded almost like Fred was tapping out HCH. If anyone watching can translate it, please feel free to mention it in the comments what you think he was saying. All I know is that was not SOS. Carp and his henchmen spent much of their time trying to trap the gang in locked rooms, only to fail every single time. This is likely due to the rooms they used not having been built to hold prisoners. If only there was a place on the ship that was specifically built to keep people from escaping. Oh.
Wouldn't you know? It's locked.
Large seagoing vessels often have brigs. But why would a small research ship have one?
Attaboy, Scoob!
Do Scooby's claws not contain a quick? That should hurt like hell. When I was a kid, I once accidentally clipped my cat's claw too far down, which is why I only take my dog to the groomer to get her nails trimmed.
Professor!
Professor Poisson, are you all right?
I am fine, Fred.
Hindsight is 20/20, but if I were Fred and the gang, I'd be kicking myself for not having made the brig the first place to start the search for the professor.
And I be suggesting that we up anchor and leave this cursed spot.
I will not abort this salvage mission.
Then with your permission, we be taking the launch, sir. Ye be welcome to join us, lads.
What exactly was Carp's plan here? The three men later staged their own disappearance, making it seem as though they never made it back to shore. So what would they have done if Shaggy and Scooby had actually joined them? Take the launch the 40 miles back to shore and drop the two of them off at the pier? Or overpower them and lock them in the brig where they would later stow Poisson? Their disguises had to have been left on the sea prowler because there's no room on the launch, so it's not like they planned on heading back to land. Perhaps they were hoping the entire gang would join them, leaving just the professor on the ship. If that was the case, good luck fitting them all on that tiny boat. This was an incomprehensible choice on the part of Carp.
Look at all the wet footprints and kelp.
And there's Mr. Carp's cap and jacket.
Oh boy, it looks like the sea monsters got the crew before they made it back to port.
Worse, when the gang found the abandoned launch, ordinarily they should have immediately contacted the Coast Guard to search for the missing men. Finding the kelp monster guarding the radio room, their next option would have been to raise the anchor and try taking the boat back to shore. It was fortunate for the villains that the teenagers have a habit of never contacting the authorities until they solve the mystery first. If the three bad guys tried to prevent taking the ship back to shore, That would have only made the gang even more suspicious because, as far as they knew, the only reason the Ghost and his crew were chasing them in the first place was to get them to leave the area. What would be the gang's response if suddenly the monsters tried to make them stay? In fact, when you get down to it, the entire idea of trying to scare Poisson and everyone else away doesn't make a lot of sense. Like how Bluestone the Great used his ghost outfit to scare the gang and hassle in the castle despite being stranded on the island, what is the point of scaring victims who literally have nowhere to go? After all, Carp and the rest took the launch, and the professor refused to leave. Technically speaking, Carp's plan failed the moment Poisson refused to leave the shipwreck site. Let's consider what would have happened had the villains scared the others away. The professor would have ordered them to take the sea prowler back to shore, and then what? Without a ship of their own, how were Carp and the rest going to salvage the sunken gold?
Come on, Shaggy. You and Scooby and I will go down in the diving bell.
Are you kidding? That thing has a hole in the bottom.
The Sea Prowler was a research vessel equipped with specialized gear that would allow for deep dives with the ability to remain underwater for long periods of time, making salvaging a shipwreck a lot easier. It's not like Carp could have easily found another ship with such equipment.
And besides, there's scuba gear in the diving bell and we're all experienced divers.
I can't swim!
A-okay, Fred. Lower away!
I read you, Velma.
Wait a minute. Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby went down in the diving bell while wearing their normal clothes. But they left the bell while wearing wetsuits, and it's very difficult to wear street clothes underneath them. That diving bell didn't exactly have a private changing room. Perhaps Mystery Incorporated wasn't the first time in the franchise Shaggy and Velma were hooking up.
What a neat idea. Now they can't get back aboard.
Can't they climb up the side of the ship? The Sea Prowler isn't exactly the Queen Mary, and the waterline is not that far down from the railing.
Zoinks!
We forgot the boarding ladder was over the side.
I told you! Even if Carp did have access to another vessel, he needed the Sea Prowler specifically for one very specific purpose unique to the crime he was perpetrating. When it comes to undersea salvage, especially when it involves ships known to be carrying expensive cargo, secrecy is essential. Few, if any, professional salvagers divulge the location of a wreck once it's found, other than to their backers. After all, there's little they could do to prevent another salvage company from secretly arriving at the site and performing their own recovery operation. We don't know how long Carp and the rest worked for Poisson, but whether they were crew members for years or just hired for this one mission, the villains needed the professor to not only get the coordinates to the Diablo d'Oro, but also to maintain legitimacy should any Coast Guard ships happen upon them salvaging the wreck. If Poisson had returned to shore, he would have notified the museum of his intentions. Considering the amount of money involved, the museum would doubtless have contacted the naval authorities to keep a watch on the area until another salvage operation could be sent, thus preventing Carp and his henchmen from returning in another ship. Now, what would have happened had the gang been sufficiently frightened to abandon the professor? While having him alone on the vessel would have made it much easier for the villains to abduct him, without any crew at all, Poisson would have had to abandon the mission even if he himself wasn't intimidated. The smartest thing Carp and his henchmen could have done was nothing. Not only should they have not gone through the trouble of the pirate and sea monster disguises, but they shouldn't have even mentioned the legend of Captain Pescado. They should have gone through with the mission, used the gang as free labor to haul up all the gold, then hijacked the ship. They were on the high seas, far from help, and their victims were a middle-aged academic, a cowardly dog, 2 teenage girls, a skinny beatnik, and 1 athletic teenage boy. They take out Fred, and the rest would have had no hope. Even if they were too squeamish to make Poisson and the kids disappear permanently, they could have kept them locked in the brig until the gold was transferred off the ship, either to another vessel or at a port in a foreign country where they could have already made arrangements to sell the contraband.
Look what we found, but we don't know what they are.
They're gold detectors. If they brought any gold aboard, this should lead us right to it.
That's not a thing. Metal detectors can detect gold, but they don't have metal detectors that only detect gold.
Oh, wow! A fortune in priceless gold artifacts!
If the villains had been bringing up their stolen loot in bags, why would they dump them in a huge pile like this on the floor of the brig? Wouldn't that mean packing it all up again later? The constant running around locking the gang up in various rooms, abandoning the launch after they had left the ship, and the haphazard treatment of the recovered gold certainly makes it feel like the villains were making it up as they went along, rather than executing a well-thought-out scheme.
Professor Poisson, are you all right?
I am fine, Fred. Where are they? Where are they?
One more lap around the deck house, Velma. I've a plan to catch those creeps.
When the gang rescued Poisson, why didn't he immediately tell them who the ghost pirate and monsters really were? The note he left made it clear he knew who kidnapped him, yet he's still running around the ship like they're ghosts.
Here they come, Shag. On your mark, get set, nets away!
Fred finally managed to drop a net on the bad guys and not catch either Shaggy or Scooby.
You kids amaze me.
In real life, Jacques Cousteau was into women less than half his age, so yeah, why don't you watch where you're putting your hands there, Professor?
Speak not lightly about Captain Pescado, lassie. And we would have succeeded if it hadn't been for these meddling laddies and lasses. Speak not lightly about Captain Pescado, lassie. And we would have succeeded if it hadn't been for these meddling laddies and lasses.
Didn't you used to have that on the other side?
What?
Your, Oh, never mind.
Despite how much their scheme was worth and the quality of their disguises, Carp and the rest dropped the ball when it came to how they went about things, succeeding only in kidnapping Poisson and failing everywhere else. Had they at least tried to kill the professor or the gang, they might have redeemed themselves. As it was, though, they get a paltry 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves Carp, McFinn, and McGill with a final due score of 3.2 out of 5.
You look just great, Scooby.
Yeah, like the $6 million dog.
$6 million dog?
Sure, just let the unleashed canine walk all over the ship wearing the priceless gold artifacts. It's not like they haven't already been treated roughly by being unceremoniously dumped on the deck of a ship after having precariously survived 3 centuries in the harsh ocean depths. Also, while the jewelry may have remained intact under the sea, there is no way the cloth in that crown would have survived. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Zora. Thank you, Zora. Beagle Boy. Thank you, Beagle Boy. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. While attending a professional football game, the gang are confused to see the star quarterback for their team suddenly disappear while being carried off the field after scoring the winning touchdown. Their confusion turns to terror as a ghost appears, vowing vengeance. Years ago, former coach Buck Bender was fired by the owner of the Hawks football team, Mr. Prentice. Bender now wanted payback, and by scaring away fans, hoped the loss of ticket sales would bankrupt his former employer. This is therefore another one of the more rare Scooby villain schemes where the bad guy wasn't out for money, but rather revenge. This is why you do not let your unleashed dog wander a football field.
Over there.
The double malt 4 hot dogs and 6 pizzas are finally getting to him.
At this point, if I was Scooby, I'd just let whatever ghost or monster the gang runs into get Velma and the rest, since they never want to believe him when he says he saw something supernatural despite all the times he was right. Bender's plan involved dressing up as the Rambling Ghost, the spirit of an old football player from the 1930s who, after being booed off the field during his last game, placed a curse on the old stadium before disappearing without a trace. Bender also kidnapped 2 of the Hawks' star players to sabotage
How? When?
the team, ensuring their loss in the upcoming big game and hopefully eroding ticket sales even further.
It was back in the 30s that a player called Rambling Ghost laid a curse on the stadium after the crowd booed him off the field.
Why would the ghost take Flash?
Because without him playing, it'll be impossible for us to win.
Shaggy and Scooby are simply the worst house guests. Leave those trophies alone!
Well, the fans are really frightened. It has to hurt the ticket sales for the Wonder Bowl game. It could wipe me out.
We'll do everything we can to solve the mystery. Don't worry, Mr. Prentice. If that ghost tries anything funny at tomorrow night's practice session, we'll be there.
Yeah, forget the millionaire owner hiring extra security for the team. These 4 teenagers and their dog will be more than sufficient. It's unclear why the loss of ticket sales from a single game would bankrupt Mr. Prentice. This was the only time there was even a hint that the football team might have been having financial difficulties. Indeed, the first game the gang attended looked to have had all the seats filled, implying a successful number of ticket sales. The stadium also looked to be in good shape and not dirty or in a state of disrepair.
A tunnel?
Well, that figures. Mr. Prentice said the new stadium was built over the old one.
Unless my version of this episode is missing some scenes, the team's owner never said anything like that. This is the first we're hearing about this being a new stadium. Regardless, Bender uses the remnants of the older building, including trapdoors, hidden rooms, and a secret tunnel.
Secret tunnel!
Was it possible Prentice was in heavy debt from constructing the new venue? I find this a bit hard to believe, as football owners are notorious for bleeding taxpayers dry to pay for stadium construction. God forbid the billionaires open their own wallets to pay for their stuff. I do have a theory for why Prentice may have been in such dire financial straits, but I'll save my conjecture for later. Right now, we'll focus on just what appears in the episode and Bender's actions while haunting the place. Wait a minute. A villain haunts a stadium using the ghost of a disgraced athlete who disappeared many years earlier, all while using abandoned rooms from a previous construction as a hideout. Why does that sound familiar?
Nothing here. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing in here either.
For lockers, they're all strangely unlocked. As always, a revenge plot does not bode well for a Scooby villain's ranking, since such schemes are seldom profitable. In fact, it's usually the exact opposite, as the bad guy must often pay out of pocket for whatever he uses to perpetrate his crime. Costumes, phosphorus paint, movie projectors, tape recorders, and any other prop or tool used in the plot aren't free. And that's not even getting into how few of these villains seeking revenge are independently wealthy, implying they need to rely on regular employment for day-to-day living expenses. It can't be easy for a bad guy to make it to the start of his shift at the factory when he's miles away dressed up as a ghost, waiting in a gym locker for a talking dog to open the door. Kidnapping also played a key role in the design of Bender's scheme, which is never a good idea for any Scooby villain. Though in this situation, perhaps the bad guy may have been aided by the ineptitude of local law enforcement.
Can't see a thing with all that smoke.
They're coming out of it now. Oh no! Flash is gone! He's disappeared, and the police couldn't find a thing.
Velma's dialogue implies the police had already completed their search of the stadium, and as this was the same evening as the disappearance, it would seem the authorities could not have spent more than a couple of hours on the scene. Do you suppose if they had spent a bit more time searching the grounds, they might have had more luck finding the missing player? The police must have been aware that the stadium had been built over the foundation of the previous one, and there were unused rooms and tunnels underneath, so why did they not investigate those areas?
Another trap!
It's no use, kids. You're trapped.
Flash Granger and Crunch Connors!
It's obvious they didn't, because later, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby easily found the missing players themselves. Granted, the three of them were dropped into the hidden room by the rambling ghost, but had the police made it this far in their search, surely the missing players would have shouted for help once they heard the scraping feet of investigators above them.
Don't call me Shirley.
This lack of police presence is also felt the next day during practice. You'd think a professional football team would merit a bit of extra protection considering the money involved. This is also something I'll discuss later. One positive aspect of the kidnappings is Bender didn't need to keep the men captive for more than a few days. His goal was to sink ticket sales, make the Hawks lose the big game, and financially ruin Prentice. Once that was done, he could slip away back to whatever life he had, satisfied that his thirst for vengeance had been slaked. The other positive aspect was there being no need to silence any witnesses, as the victims had no idea who had abducted them. Bender didn't have to worry about murder weighing on his conscience, or more severe criminal penalties should he be brought to justice later. Ultimately, this was an unoriginal plot with no possibility of financial gain. It did, however, seem to have a reasonable chance of success, and, admittedly, money isn't everything. I'm awarding Bender's design a 2.5 out of 5. This may be the second appearance of a ghost athlete, as well as one from the early 20th century, but at least the character model was original and admittedly frightening with its gaunt, mummified face, red, sunken eyes, and tattered football uniform. The number 13 on the jersey was a bit on the nose, but that's not worthy of any point deductions. In fact, despite the superstition assigned to that number, it's a common one that's been assigned to many players over the years. Bender's costume also featured special effects, including a glowing attribute around just the head for some reason. Maybe he couldn't get hold of more than just a small bucket of phosphorus paint and had to make do with just the helmet.
It's a rambling ghost!
An odd sound effect was also present whenever the rambling ghost appeared, but like the glowing, it's never explained anywhere in the episode. It's also possible that the sound was meant to be non-diegetic and only heard by the audience and not the characters in the show itself. Perhaps the producers used it to sell the creepiness of the ghost, and it should have been considered the same as background music. The name Rambling Ghost may have been inspired by the real-life Red Grange, a 1920s and 30s era football player nicknamed the Galloping Ghost. It stands to reason there were fans of the player at Hanna-Barbera, considering 2 years after this episode aired, they'd release a cartoon using this nickname as the title, even though the main character wasn't actually given that name. Cycling back to the originality of this ghost, I couldn't find any other football player spirits in pop culture other than the unfortunate team hanging out in the afterlife in Beetlejuice. I had assumed the idea of a haunting perpetrated by the non-corporeal essence of a gridiron great would be fodder for any number of film or television appearances. But after spending a lot more time than it was really worth looking, the Rambling Ghost was the only one I could find. If anyone knows what I missed, please feel free to leave a comment below. Original and scary, with special effects and appropriate for the location of the haunting, the Rambling Ghost is a quintessential Scooby villain. I have to give Bender a 5 out of 5 for his outfit. I began my operation analysis of the previous episode's villains by reminding viewers of my oft-repeated complaint that kidnapping is one of the stupidest mistakes a Scooby villain can make. While I still stand by this, in the case of the Rambling Ghost, I can see why it would work out for him. As I already discussed Bender's kidnapping of Flash Granger and Crunch Connors, I won't go into it much more, apart from pointing out an odd aspect of the abduction.
I remember being carried along on the shoulders of my teammates, and suddenly everything went black.
I blacked out too, right after I fell in that trapdoor on the field.
Both men mentioned having blacked out, which would indicate they were rendered unconscious by Bender. Additionally, both were wearing helmets and accustomed to taking blows to the head on the field and remaining upright. This would suggest the villain had to have used some sort of gas or drug to knock them out. The favorite chemical of choice would be chloroform, despite how in real life it could take up to 5 minutes to render someone unconscious, and not instantly as seen in most movies and television. This is not to mention that even back in 1976, it would have been difficult for Bender to get hold of any. What would have been the purpose of that room in the first place? It had been built under the abandoned Hall of Fame, but didn't have any other doors leading to it other than a hatch in the ceiling. It's tempting to think of it as a mere storage room, as we see uniforms spread out on the floor, but as they're directly under the trapdoor, it's possible Bender put them there as a cushion for his victims. Which was thoughtful, as not all Scooby villains do that.
Relax. It's only the old Greats of the Gridiron Hall of Fame.
Also, how could they even see in there? The room is underground and there were no light sources. The only opening is that trapdoor, which was under an abandoned area of the old stadium, which, come to think of it, was also very well lit despite not having any windows. Not that this would have mattered as it was currently nighttime outside. The old Hall of Fame did seem to have plenty of lighting despite having been abandoned. Who's paying for the electricity to keep this place so brightly lit? Are high utility bills the reason the team owners seem to be hurting for cash? Also, both players are still wearing their helmets and padding. You'd think they would have removed them by now to be more comfortable in the locked room. It's almost like Flash and Crunch knew it cost money for Hanna-Barbera to pay someone to draw them without any headgear. Incidentally, while Crunch may have only been in that room for a few hours, Flash had been trapped in there for over a day. Velma? Shaggy? Scooby? You might want to avoid the corners.
It's our old coaching staff. There's Baxter and myself, but we haven't seen the others for 10 years. Buck Bender, one of my old coaches.
He was in the newspaper picture the Phantom had.
I fired Buck Bender years ago.
Look at Buck Bender. Prentice said the newspaper photo was taken a decade earlier, but also that he fired Bender years ago. From this, we can infer that Bender had been let go anywhere from 2 to 9 years prior. It can't be determined exactly how old Bender was in the photo, but the average coach in the NFL would be in his early 40s. If Bender was particularly young in that photo, he would still likely to have been in his 30s at the time it was taken, making him at least in his mid to late 40s now. He certainly looks like he could be that age or older at the end of the episode. He also does not look exactly ripped. Just the opposite, really, as his arms, chest, and waist look very thin in the ghost disguise. Flash Granger and Crunch Connors, conversely, were young football players in their prime. They were tall, muscular, and wearing their uniforms, including their helmets and heavy padding. Somehow Bender was able to not only overpower the men allegedly by himself, but also carry their heavy, unconscious bodies to the underground storage room? I'll come back to this later.
Hey, Scoob, like I think I found a clue!
Look out!
The paper! Paper!
We'll lose him in the steam room!
I know it's a cartoon, but one of the things that set the Scooby-Doo franchise apart from other Hanna-Barbera cartoons like Yogi Bear or the Flintstones is they seem to be a bit more grounded in reality. Talking dog aside. Then you get stuff like this. Cartoon physics. Was the same company that installed the Whirlpool responsible for the rotating restaurant at Aqualand? Why did Bender keep the newspaper lying around the locker room when it could only implicate him if it was found? And why did he feel the need to circle the photo showing the old coaching staff, including himself? There couldn't have been anything in the article he needed for a scheme. Did he keep old clippings handy to periodically pull out and make himself angry and stay motivated enough to stick with the plan?
They closed it down years ago when they built the new stadium.
And of course, they left all the trophies, portraits, and everything else in the museum when they closed it.
A rambling ghost!
What was Bender even doing at the desk in the abandoned museum? His plan didn't include ransom notes or threatening letters. What was he working on? His taxes?
I've got the paper!
Like, wait for me!
That was not the same paper Scooby was trying to take off the desk. Setting aside why they left them there in the Hall of Fame after they closed it, how do those footballs still have any air in them all these years later? Inflated balls leak over time.
Jeepers! He just disappeared!
We find out later that Crunch Connors actually fell through a trapdoor here, despite this looking nothing like someone falling through a trapdoor here. Or sounding like it either, since it was accompanied by one of Hanna-Barbera's magic sound effects.
Zoinks! He disappeared!
Are you sure, Shaggy? Because that sound effect made it seem like Scooby was just assassinated by James Bond. Scooby ran afoul of the same trapdoor that caught Crunch Connors earlier. A trapdoor that was somehow installed on the practice field, despite this being a significant feat of engineering that logically could not have been carried out by Bender. Setting aside the improbability of the trapdoor's existence, Bender having not locked the device to prevent others from blundering into it and thus finding the tunnel underneath the field was a huge mistake.
I've made a huge mistake.
The ghost jumped us and we ran for it, and here we are!
That might have been the ghost we saw run inside the scoreboard.
There's a man in there.
What happened, Mr.
Ellsworth, I'm the scoreboard operator. The rambling ghost grabbed me, and that's all I remember.
It's Bulldog Kratotsky. What are you doing here? I saw the Phantom, so I ducked in here.
This sequence was baffling. It began with Fred wondering if the rambling ghost that had been chasing Shaggy and Scooby was the same one they saw enter the scoreboard room. Except at no point did we see this happen. The closest we got to that was when the rambling ghost appeared on top of the scoreboard during the game before disappearing. Nevertheless, the gang investigated and found Mr. Ellsworth, the scoreboard operator, who seemed to have been rendered unconscious in a ransacked room, the state of which nobody seemed to notice. The teenagers then met another football player who claimed to have seen the ghost and ducked inside the room to hide. This particular player showed up only one time later in the background, and we eventually learned that Ellsworth was actually Buck Bender in a secondary disguise. This whole section of the episode felt like it was included simply to keep the audience guessing by adding additional characters who could have been the ghost. The ransacked room, the player, and even the inclusion of Ellsworth as another disguise for Bender never enter into the resolution at the end. The only reason I even bring up this part of the episode at all was because I was looking for mistakes made by Bender, and at first I thought, oh, he was sloppy because he was seen entering the scoreboard room by multiple people. Except it wasn't really a mistake because it ended up having zero bearing on anything that happened later. There does seem to be plenty of unanswered questions surrounding Bender and his actions in the episode, but I have a theory that may go a long way toward explaining not only those, but also why Mr. Prentice may have been so desperate for his team to win the big game.
It's the closing minutes of play, and the capacity crowd is going wild. The score is Hawks 0, Cougars 0, and we have only 1 minute and 8 seconds remaining in the game.
Admittedly, I don't know much about football, but with no touchdowns scored by either side and with only a minute left in the game, does this mean both teams were really good or really bad?
Hey, here's our big chance. They're sending Flash Granger in the game.
Yeah, like he's the Hawk star player!
Admittedly, I don't know much about football, but is it common to keep your star player off the field until near the end? I can't help but wonder if the score would still have been tied at 0 this late in the game had Flash been playing a lot earlier in the evening.
My God, they've shot him!
And with a point after, the Hawks win it 7-0.
Admittedly, I don't know much about football, but with only a minute left in the game before Flash made his touchdown, and with his team now having been in the lead, would the Hawks really have tried for the extra point kick? Wouldn't they have instead simply ridden out the clock to prevent the Cougars from possibly getting possession of the ball and tying the game, unlikely as that may be? Was this an attempt to increase the score in order to cover the spread for potential gamblers? And where there's gamblers, there's often organized crime. Yep, I'm talking about the mob. Is it possible that the reason Prentice was so worried about the loss of ticket sales and his team losing the big game was because he was in debt to mobsters? The involvement of a crime syndicate would explain a lot in the episode. For starters, gambling debts could be why Prentice was having enough money trouble that a single canceled game would ruin him. Gambling on his own team would also explain his desperation for the big game to take place and for his team to win. Not to mention the strange choice of the Hawks going for that extra point at the end of the previous game, despite the danger that it could potentially have cost them the win. It's possible the mobsters were counting on Prentice to lose so they could take over the stadium themselves. This almost happened once before in a Scooby episode. Turning a high school stadium into a gambling track was the villain's plot in the earlier episode of the new Scooby-Doo movies that featured the ghost of an old athlete. Mobsters helping Bender's plot would explain how he was able to build the trapdoors all over the stadium, considering organized crime often has access to construction equipment. The criminal gang could also have supplied Bender with the extra muscle needed to carry the unconscious players to the underground prison, not to mention securing the chemicals used to knock them out in the first place. Perhaps they even got them from Dr. Jekyll. Bribes would also explain why the local police did such a poor job searching the stadium grounds for Flash Granger after his disappearance, as well as why they didn't station any officers on the field to offer extra protection for the Hawks. The need to establish a patsy should their plans go awry could also be the reason why a newspaper article implicating Bender was left on the shelf in the training room. If my theory has any weight to it, this could be the second time the Scooby Gang interfered with the mob. They might want to start watching their backs because mobsters aren't the kind of people to ignore meddling.
Last practice tonight.
If that doesn't lure the Phantom back to strike again, nothing will.
And what a great idea to have Shaggy and Scooby play disguised in the uniforms of Flash Granger and Crunch Connor.
Yes, who wouldn't be fooled by Shaggy and Scooby, a skinny white kid and a Great Dane dressed as two large football players? Especially when their uniform numbers don't even match.
This is a trick football. It's self-inflating. When the Phantom shows up to grab you two, just stuff it in his shirt. It'll blow up like a big balloon and we'll have him.
How? How will that trap him? If history is anything to go by in the Scooby-Doo-niverse, an inflated balloon will simply make the person holding it rise and fall. It won't actually trap them.
Okay, now, let's try those passes.
Wait a minute. If Shaggy and Scooby are supposed to lure the rambling ghost out by dressing up as Flash Granger and Crunch Connors, why in the hell is Crunch Connors right there on the field next to them? Wearing his own uniform, I might add. I've said it before and I'll say it again. You do not let untrained people run heavy equipment.
He'll never catch us now!
How in the hell did they turn around inside the back of that van? See what I mean? Fred's plan to use an inflating football was just a stupid idea. If we discount mob involvement, Bender made enough mistakes in the episode to have a significant impact on his score. Leaving the trapdoor unlocked, unnecessarily keeping an incriminating newspaper article lying around, circling a photo of himself in the article, falling for Fred's trap despite Shaggy and Scooby blatantly not being Flash and Crunch. He did successfully kidnap the two players, but this was cancelled out by leaving unnecessary equipment in the storage room that allowed them to be freed by the gang. 1 out of 5 for his operation score. This leaves Buck Bender, the rambling ghost, with a final due score of 2.8 out of 5.
I can never thank you kids enough, but I'll start with free tickets on the 50-yard line for tomorrow's Wonder Bowl.
Why, terrific!
What a battle it's been today! No score, only 10 seconds left to play.
Again with the score tied at 0. It's fortunate that the gang were given free tickets. I feel bad for everyone in the stadium who paid money to see this game.
And look at that scoreboard. It says, Wonder Bowl champs, the Hawks, with special thanks to us.
That is a surprisingly high-def scoreboard for 1976. And that's my ranking of the villains from the 7th set of episodes of the first season of the Scooby-Doo show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. This is my second to last ranking video for this season, and it's encouraging that the two villains featured enjoyed a significant uptick in their scores, with both achieving an above average ranking. I don't know if this means we can expect the same for the last 2 set of bad guys in the final 2 episodes, though I peeked at the ones coming up next and can't help but think they look familiar. Fingers crossed. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. By the way, I'm sorry about implying that ham radio enthusiasts don't have sex.